Picture this, a ruined European street. Smoke hangs between shattered buildings. Somewhere in the distance, sirens scream. Boots pound against concrete. Then silence. A soldier breathes, slowly. Carefully and through the darkness, one object emerges. A gas mask, not the face behind it, just the mask. One breath, two, three. The sound grows louder. Because behind that rubber and glass is a terrifying possibility, a weapon you cannot see, a poison you cannot outrun, a death that can arrive with the wind. But what if one of the most important ideas behind protective breathing equipment began decades before the world entered its deadliest war, with a black inventor who wasn't trying to win a war at all? His name was Garrett Morgan, and in 1912 he was thinking about something much closer to home: fire, smoke, and the men who walked directly into both. Morgan had watched firefighters disappear into buildings filled with choking fumes. They could see the flames, but the invisible enemy was worse. Smoke could blind them. Poisonous gases could overwhelm them. A few breaths could mean the difference between walking out and never coming home. So Morgan began experimenting. He built a strange-looking hood, fabric. Air passages, a design intended to help a person breathe where ordinary lungs could not. It looked simple, almost primitive, but sometimes history-changing inventions begin by looking ridiculous. And Morgan was about to discover just how powerful his idea could become, because this wasn't merely a hood. It was a way to put distance between a human being and the air trying to kill him. But here's where the story takes a turn. Morgan wasn't a famous scientist working inside a powerful laboratory. He was a black inventor working in an America where recognition was not handed out equally. He had to build, experiment, fail, try again, and prove himself in a world determined to overlook him. Then came the moment that changed everything. A disaster struck. Workers became trapped underground. The air was toxic. Rescuers hesitated. Every breath inside could become their last. Morgan entered. Into the smoke, into the poison, wearing his breathing device. And suddenly, the strange invention wasn't strange anymore. It worked. Men who might have died had a chance to breathe. Morgan's device gained attention. But history is rarely fair about where an idea begins. Decades passed. The world changed. Factories expanded. Armies grew. And eventually, Europe erupted into war. World War II? Chemical warfare was no longer a nightmare from the imagination. It was a threat governments had to prepare for. Soldiers trained in gas masks. Factories produced protective equipment. Warnings spread through military camps. Millions prepared for an enemy they couldn't see. And somewhere behind that terrifying technology was a question. How much of the future had already been imagined by Garrett Morgan because his invention had been created decades earlier? The battlefield came later. The need came later. But the fundamental problem remained the same. How do you keep a human being alive when the air itself becomes the enemy? Morgan had already been asking that question, long before the soldiers, long before the sirens, long before the world went to war. And yet, when people remember the history of protective equipment, his name is often far quieter than the invention deserves. That may be the most haunting part. The mask survived, the idea survived, the need survived, but the man behind the idea faded into the background. So the next time you see an old wartime photograph, a soldier standing behind a mask, remember what you're really looking at. Not just rubber, not just glass, not just military equipment. You're looking at the legacy of an inventor who saw danger in the air and decided human beings deserved a way to breathe. But there's still one question left. If Garrett Morgan had already created a revolutionary breathing device decades before World War II, how did his invention influence the protective technology that followed? And why did a man who helped change the way people survived toxic environments receive so little credit? Because sometimes, the most important stories in history aren't buried because they were insignificant. They're buried because nobody bothered to dig deep enough. Imagine walking into a burning building, knowing the fire might not be what kills you, the smoke might. Your eyes sting, your lungs tighten, every breath becomes smaller than the one before it. And somewhere inside that darkness, someone is waiting to be rescued. But how do you save them if you can't even breathe? America was changing, factories were rising, cities were expanding. And with that growth came danger. Firefighters rushed into buildings filled with smoke, heat, and poisonous fumes. Their equipment was crude, their protection was limited, they had courage. They had training, but courage doesn't create oxygen, and Garrett Morgan noticed something others seemed willing to accept. A firefighter could survive the flames and still lose the fight against the air. That realization stayed with him. If you cannot breathe, you cannot rescue anyone, so Morgan began experimenting. Not inside some prestigious laboratory. There was no university research team surrounding him, no government grant waiting on the next breakthrough. Just a man looking at a problem and refusing to accept it. He studied how smoke moved, how air behaved, how a person might breathe more safely inside an environment that could kill them. Then he started building, piece by piece, testing, adjusting, trying again, until an unusual device began to take shape. A hood designed to help protect the wearer from smoke and dangerous fumes while providing access to cleaner air. It became known as the safety hood. And in 1914, Morgan received a patent for his breathing device. For a moment, it looked like the hardest part was over. He had the invention, he had the patent, he had proof that the idea worked. But then Morgan discovered something more difficult than smoke, something he couldn't solve with gears, fabric, or mechanical ingenuity. People had to believe in him. And America was not ready to believe equally in every inventor. Morgan was black, and that mattered. His invention could speak for itself, but prejudice didn't listen to inventions. It judged the man holding them. Imagine creating something that could help save a firefighter's life, and still having to convince people that you were capable of creating it. That was Morgan's next battle, not against fire, not against poison, against doubt, against stereotypes, against a society that could look directly at black achievement and still refuse to see it. But Morgan wasn't finished, because he understood something important. If people wouldn't trust the inventor, perhaps they would trust the results. And soon, Garrett Morgan would have the opportunity to demonstrate his safety hood under conditions so dangerous that even the skeptics would have to pay attention. The strange device he'd built in relative obscurity was about to enter the smoke, and this time there would be lives on the other side of it. The mask worked. That should have been the end of the story. It wasn't. Garrett Morgan had built something that could help a person breathe through smoke and dangerous fumes. He demonstrated it. He proved it. Again and again. But there was another test his invention couldn't pass so easily: the color of the man behind it. In parts of segregated America, some buyers were willing to trust the device, but not the black inventor who created it. Think about that. A machine could be trusted. A patent could be trusted. A life-saving invention could be trusted. But the man behind it, that was where prejudice drew the line. Morgan understood the brutal reality. If he wanted his invention to reach the people who needed it, he might have to hide himself. So he did something almost unthinkable. He hired a white actor to present the invention. And Morgan himself appeared in demonstrations under a disguise. The audience could watch the device. They could see it work. They could hear the explanation. They could believe in the technology. Because they didn't know who had created it. And then came the cruel irony. The invention became easier to accept when the world couldn't see the black man behind it. Imagine the silence Morgan must have carried, watching someone else stand in front of the crowd while his own invention took the applause. Knowing that the mask was being judged fairly only because he wasn't. But Morgan didn't walk away. He understood something deeper. If the invention could save a life, then pride had to come second. Recognition could wait. The lives couldn't, so he kept demonstrating, kept selling. Kept pushing the safety hood into a world that had already decided what a black inventor was supposed to be capable of. And then, everything changed. July 1916. Beneath Lake Erie, men are working inside a tunnel. Then an explosion, the ground shakes. A violent blast tears through the darkness. And suddenly the tunnel fills with smoke, dust, and poisonous gas. Men are trapped underground. They scream for help. But the air itself has become the enemy. Rescuers rush toward the entrance. They go in, then they stop. Some don't come back, because this isn't an ordinary rescue anymore. Every step into that tunnel could become a death sentence. Every breath could be the last. And then someone remembers a strange invention. A safety hood. A device designed to help firefighters survive smoke and dangerous fumes. Garrett Morgan is called. And this is the moment that matters. He could have stayed outside. He could have handed the device to someone else. He could have said, Let them test it, but Morgan doesn't. He puts on the hood himself. His brother Frank joins him, and together they descend. Into darkness, into poison, into the same tunnel that had already defeated other rescuers. Imagine the sound. Boots striking the tunnel floor, metal scraping against concrete, breathing inside the hood. Slow, steady, deliberate. Morgan can't see far ahead. He doesn't know what waits in the darkness. But he keeps moving, because somewhere inside, men are still alive. And suddenly the invention that once looked like an unusual experiment has become something else. A lifeline. Morgan and the other rescuers search through the wreckage. Then they find survivors. 8 men are located alive during the rescue effort. 8 people who might never have seen daylight again. But 20 others die in the disaster. 20 lives swallowed by the tunnel. 20 families waiting for people who would never return home. And Morgan, he walks back out, alive. His invention has just faced the ultimate test. Not in a laboratory, not in front of investors, not on a stage, in poison, in darkness, in death. And it worked. But here's the part that hurts. You would think this was the moment America finally embraced Garrett Morgan, the black inventor who had risked his own life, the man who had entered a tunnel others feared to enter, the inventor whose device helped make the rescue possible. You would think his name would become famous overnight. It didn't happen that way. His heroism was not always given the recognition it deserved, and Morgan still faced the same racial barriers that had followed him before the disaster. The invention had proven itself. The man behind it was still fighting to be seen. Think about that. He had walked into poisonous darkness to save strangers. But when he stepped back into the light, America still struggled to see him clearly. Yet Morgan kept building, kept inventing, kept moving forward. Because the tunnel had taught him something history would eventually learn too. An invention can change the world long before the world is willing to give its inventor credit. And Morgan's story was nowhere near finished, because across the Atlantic, a war was coming, a war that would turn poison gas into a terrifying weapon. A war where millions of soldiers would need protection from an enemy they could not see. And when that war arrived, the world had learned how to survive poison gas. Now it had to prepare for it all over again. 1939, Europe burns, cities tremble beneath bombs, aircraft roar overhead, tanks tear across borders. And beneath the noise of engines and artillery, military planners fear something they cannot see. Chemical warfare, because a bullet has a direction, a bomb has a target. But gas can move with the wind. It can slip into trenches, buildings, bunkers, barracks. It can turn ordinary air into a weapon, so soldiers train again and again. They stand in rows, waiting for the command. Then, gas! Everything changes. Hands move, masks come up, straps tighten, rubber seals against skin, glass covers the eyes, breathing becomes slower, heavier, mechanical. For a moment, the soldier no longer looks like a man. He looks like a machine built to survive. But beneath all that modern equipment was an old lesson. A lesson Garrett Morgan had understood decades earlier. If you cannot breathe, you cannot survive. And that idea had traveled a long way. Morgan did not create the entire gas mask system used during World War II. He did not personally design every mask worn by Allied soldiers. And the historical record connects his safety hood more directly to the protective equipment developed before, and during World War I, that distinction matters. Because the real story is not that one forgotten inventor secretly created the masks that won World War II. The real story is more human, more complicated, and in many ways more powerful. Morgan created a device to protect human beings from smoke and dangerous fumes, an idea born from factories, fire, observation, persistence. That idea became part of a much larger technological lineage. Engineers improved it. New filters appeared, materials changed, military designs evolved, and the basic principle remained. Keep the poison out, keep the person breathing. Decades passed. The technology became more sophisticated, the wars became more destructive. And suddenly, the world depended on protective equipment against weapons capable of turning the atmosphere itself into a battlefield. Think about that. An invention created for firefighters belonged to a much bigger story than the man who first built it could have imagined. Morgan wasn't designing for generals. He wasn't planning for world wars. He was trying to save people trapped in smoke. But history has a strange way of taking one person's solution and carrying it somewhere they never expected. And perhaps that's the greatest legacy of Garrett Morgan, not that his exact device appeared unchanged on every battlefield. It didn't. Not that he single-handedly created modern military gas masks. He didn't. His legacy is the idea. The proof that protective breathing technology could give human beings a fighting chance when the air itself became dangerous. And while soldiers practiced removing and sealing their masks in seconds, Morgan's name remained far less visible than the technology's importance. That is the strange tragedy of invention. The idea can become famous while the inventor disappears. The mask remains, the method evolves, the technology survives, but the name behind the first spark can fade. And yet every time a protective mask seals around a face, every time a filter separates clean air from danger, there is an echo of the question Morgan asked more than a century ago. How do you keep a human being alive when the world around him becomes impossible to breathe? The wars changed, the masks changed, the technology changed, but that question never disappeared, and neither did Morgan's place in the story. Imagine being a soldier in Europe and hearing one word that could freeze an entire battlefield. Gas! No gunshot, no approaching tank, no enemy soldier charging through the smoke, just air. The same air you've been breathing all morning has suddenly become the thing that might kill you. For one terrifying second, you don't know where the enemy is, you can't shoot it. You can't outrun it, you can't see it, then everything happens at once. Hands reach for masks, straps tighten. Rubber seals against skin, the soldier bends forward, breathing through a filter. And suddenly the battlefield sounds different. The explosions are still there, the artillery is still shaking the ground, but inside the mask there is only breath. In, out, in, out. The mask is doing more than filtering the air. It is fighting fear. Because when you cannot see what is trying to kill you, your imagination becomes the enemy. What if the filter fails? What if the seal breaks? What if the gas is already here, but then the mask gives the soldier something precious? A chance, a few more seconds. A barrier between the human body and the invisible world outside. And here's the strange part. The massive chemical battlefield many soldiers feared never unfolded on the scale they imagined during World War II. The masks remained ready, packed, inspected, practiced with. Symbols of a nightmare that might arrive at any moment, but never became the defining weapon of the war. Still, the fear was real. Civilian populations prepared, soldiers trained. Factories produced protective equipment by the thousands. Governments planned for the worst, because sometimes preparing for a weapon is almost as terrifying as using one. And behind all of that technology, behind the filters, the rubber, the straps, the military drills was an idea born decades earlier, not in a battlefield, not in a military laboratory. But in the mind of Garrett Morgan, his original goal was much simpler. He wanted firefighters to breathe. That was it. A man entering a burning building should have a chance to come back out. Morgan wasn't trying to reshape warfare. He wasn't trying to create an icon of modern military equipment. He was trying to solve one human problem. Smoke fills the room. You cannot see. You cannot breathe. Someone needs help. What do? Morgan's answer was simple. Build something that gives the lungs a chance. And that simple idea became part of a much larger story. From burning buildings, to industrial disasters, to the terrifying possibility of chemical warfare, the same basic principle kept returning. Protect the breath, protect the person. Give them one more chance to survive. That's what makes Morgan's story so powerful. The world eventually placed his idea in contexts he could never have predicted. Wars, factories, emergency rescue. Military preparation, but at the heart of it was never war, it was life, one breath, then another, and another. Today, protective breathing equipment can seem ordinary, a mask, a filter, a seal. A piece of equipment sitting quietly until danger arrives. But imagine the first moment someone realized that a device could stand between a human being and poisonous air. That realization changed more than one man's life. It became part of a century-long evolution in protecting people from invisible danger. And perhaps that is the legacy Garrett Morgan deserves to be remembered for, not because he single-handedly created every modern gas mask. He didn't. Not because his original device remained unchanged. It didn't. but because he saw a problem others had learned to accept and asked a dangerous question. What if breathing didn't have to be a death sentence? Sometimes history doesn't remember the person who built the first bridge. It remembers the people who crossed it. But every time someone survives because they can breathe where others cannot, that first idea is still there, quietly, behind the mask, one breath at a time. Garrett Morgan had already fought a war long before WWII began. There were no trenches, no rifles, no armies marching across borders. His battlefield was America. And his enemy was prejudice. He had invented something that could help people breathe through smoke and dangerous fumes. He had demonstrated it. He had tested it. He had even risked his own life using it. But there was one problem his invention couldn't solve: the color of its inventor. Some people wanted the safety hood. Some fire departments ordered it. They believed in the device. But in parts of the segregated South, orders were canceled after buyers learned the inventor was black. Think about that. The mask was good enough. The technology was good enough. The life-saving idea was good enough, but the man behind it wasn't, and Morgan knew exactly what that meant. He had already learned to disguise himself during demonstrations. He had watched people become more comfortable with his invention when they didn't know who created it. Then came the Lake Erie disaster. Morgan entered the poisonous tunnel himself. He helped find survivors. He risked his own life, and yet the recognition was uneven. The U.S. Patent and Trademark Office notes that Morgan was denied monetary compensation received by other rescuers. Imagine walking into a tunnel where the air could kill you, saving people you had never met, and then watching others receive the credit and compensation you were denied. That kind of injustice can break a person, but Morgan didn't disappear. He built again and again, because perhaps he understood something that history often forgets. You don't always get to choose whether people recognize your work, but you can choose whether you keep creating, so he kept going. Morgan would later develop another invention that would become famous far beyond the world of firefighting: the three-position traffic signal. He built businesses. He published a newspaper. He became involved in advocacy for racial equality. He refused to become invisible, and that may be the most important part of his story, because Morgan wasn't just fighting to sell a product. He was fighting for the right to be seen as what he already was: an inventor, an entrepreneur, a problem solver, a black man whose ideas could save lives. But history has a strange habit. It remembers the object and forgets the person. We remember the mask, we remember the traffic signal, we remember the technology. But how many people remember the man who stood behind those inventions? How many know the name Garrett Morgan? How many know that before modern protective equipment became commonplace, he was asking a simple question: how do you protect a human being from something they cannot see? And how many know that before the world learned to breathe through the mask, Morgan had to fight simply to be believed? That's the irony. The invention became visible. The inventor became invisible. But Morgan refused to disappear. He kept building, kept speaking, kept fighting, kept leaving evidence that he had been there. And perhaps that is why his story still matters today. Because recognition is not always proof of greatness. Sometimes the greatest proof is what survives after your name has been forgotten: a mask, a signal, a newspaper, an idea. And a legacy still moving through the world, even when the world doesn't remember who started it. Millions of soldiers are moving across the world. Ships cross dark oceans. Aircraft fill the sky. Factories work through the night. Steel, rubber, glass, millions of pieces of equipment prepared for a war that seems capable of destroying everything. And inside a soldier's kit, there is a mask. Maybe it will never be used. Maybe the soldier will never need it. But it is there, waiting. Because everyone understands what it means. The enemy might not need to shoot you. The enemy might attack the air. The very thing keeping you alive could become the weapon. One command: gas, and everything changes. A soldier reaches for the mask. Hands shake, straps tighten. The filter locks into place. Breathing continues. In, out, in, out. For a few moments, that simple object stands between life and death. But here's the part history often misses. The sophisticated equipment surrounding those soldiers did not appear from nowhere. Every advanced technology has an ancestor. Every polished machine began as something rough, something experimental, something that looked almost too simple to matter. And decades earlier, Garrett Morgan had been standing beside one of those ideas. A hood, a few tubes, a basic design. Nothing like the advanced protective equipment of a world war, but that was never the point. Morgan wasn't trying to build the final answer. He was trying to solve the problem in front of him. Smoke. Poison, danger, breathing, that was his battlefield, and he attacked it with observation, persistence, ingenuity. He looked at a firefighter entering a burning building and saw something others had learned to accept. A person could be brave enough to enter and still be defeated by the air. So Morgan asked a simple question. What if we could give that person a chance to breathe? That question became a device. The device became a demonstration. The demonstration became a rescue tool. And the idea became part of a much larger evolution in protective breathing technology. Then history accelerated. Wars came, technology changed, filters improved, materials became more sophisticated. Military equipment evolved. The original hood disappeared behind newer designs, but the principle survived: protect the breath, protect the person, give them another chance. And perhaps that is where Morgan's real legacy lies, not inside one specific mask, not inside one patent, but inside the idea that a human being should not have to surrender simply because the air around them has become deadly. Morgan never knew where his invention would lead. He couldn't have imagined millions of soldiers carrying protective masks through another world war. He couldn't have predicted the laboratories, factories, engineers, and military planners that would continue refining the technology. He was simply solving the danger in front of him. And sometimes that's how history changes, not with someone knowing they are creating the future, but with someone looking at an ordinary problem and refusing to accept it. The mask eventually became bigger than the man. It traveled farther than he did. It entered wars he never fought. It evolved into technology he never designed. And eventually, people remembered the equipment more easily than the inventor. But behind every advanced mask, behind every filter, behind every breath protected from toxic air, there is an idea. And behind that idea was a man who once looked at smoke and asked, "What if a person could breathe here?" That question was simple. The consequences were not. Because sometimes you don't have to build the final machine to change history. Sometimes you only have to build the first one. In 1963, Garrett Morgan dies, and the world keeps moving. The wars end, cities rebuild, factories grow, technology races forward. New materials appear, new filters, new protective systems. The masks become more sophisticated, more efficient, more familiar. And Morgan's name, it becomes quieter, much quieter, until for many people it almost disappears. But perhaps being forgotten is not the most uncomfortable part of his story. The uncomfortable part is asking why. Because invention is rarely just about intelligence. It is also about opportunity, access, money, networks, recognition, and prejudice. Morgan had the imagination to see a problem others accepted. He had the mechanical curiosity to build a solution, the persistence to test it, the business instinct to market it, and the courage to put his own life on the line when that invention was needed most. He didn't simply draw an idea on paper. He entered a poisonous tunnel. He risked his lungs. He risked his life. He proved that his device could work when failure meant death. And still, recognition did not come easily. That is the part that lingers. Because imagine what it means to create something valuable, and then spend your life convincing people that it deserves to be taken seriously. Imagine watching the technology evolve while your own name fades from the conversation. Yet Morgan kept moving. He built businesses. He published a newspaper. He advocated for racial equality. And he continued inventing. One of his later inventions would become even more familiar to everyday Americans: the three-position traffic signal. A device designed to bring order to increasingly dangerous streets. Another problem, another solution, another piece of technology that could become larger than the man who created it. And that is the strange pattern of Morgan's life. He solved problems that ordinary people faced every day, but the inventions became more famous than the inventor. The traffic signal became part of the city. The safety hood became part of the history of protective breathing technology. The objects remained. The name faded. But here's the deeper story. Morgan's safety hood began with something incredibly simple: a person standing inside smoke trying to breathe. That's all. No world war, no battlefield, no grand military strategy. Just a human being facing dangerous air. Morgan saw that problem and refused to accept it. Then history took the idea somewhere he could never have predicted: industrial disasters. Military preparation, chemical warfare fears, protective equipment, a century of technological evolution. The original invention changed, the materials changed, the designs changed. But the question remained: how do we protect human life when the environment itself becomes dangerous? That question still matters today. Firefighters still enter smoke-filled buildings. Workers still encounter hazardous fumes. Emergency responders still depend on protective breathing equipment. The technology has come a long way, but the principle is familiar. Someone must be able to breathe when everyone else cannot. And maybe that's why Garrett Morgan's story deserves another look. Not because every modern mask can be traced directly to one invention. History is more complicated than that, but because Morgan represents something larger. The possibility that an idea born in an overlooked workshop can travel through generations. The possibility that a black inventor can create something powerful, even when the world refuses to give him the recognition he deserves. And the reminder that progress doesn't always remember its architects. Sometimes the invention survives, the inventor doesn't. But every time that invention protects a life, the forgotten name leaves another mark on history. Garrett Morgan may have died in 1963. But the question he asked more than half a century earlier is still waiting in every dangerous breath. When the air becomes deadly, history. The modern connection: every breath has a history today. Protective masks appear in places Morgan could never have imagined. Fire scenes, industrial disasters, military operations. Hazardous environments, emergency response. The designs are radically more advanced, the materials are different, the science is deeper. But the fundamental question remains unchanged. How do you protect a human being from an atmosphere that wants to kill them? That question connected a black inventor in early 20th century America to some of the most frightening conflicts of the modern age. And there is one final lesson. Garrett Morgan didn't need to predict the future. He simply solved a problem. Then someone else improved the solution. Then someone else built upon that improvement. And someone else carried it into another war. That is how invention really changes history, not always with one dramatic breakthrough. Sometimes with one idea that refuses to die. The final image returns to the old safety hood, then slowly dissolves into a World War II soldier wearing a protective mask. 2 generations, 2 wars, one enduring idea. And the narrator closes. Garrett Morgan did not set out to help win a world war. He set out to help people breathe. But sometimes, the smallest act of invention can travel farther than its creator ever imagined. And sometimes, history remembers the mask before it remembers the man who made it. Fade to black. Then one final line: remember the inventor behind the mask.